Greetings, greetings, greetings. You are now tuned into the vault. Trust Christian owned, nothing control everything. Just want to thank you for tuning in live, listening to replay. Always appreciate everybody that tunes in live, listens in the replay. It's always appreciated. Once again, this is the vault, episode 315, private family property. Always appreciate everybody for tuning in live, listening to replay. This is actually Sunday trustee training for trustees. But this particular episode is going to be catered towards private family property, and we're going to move forward in that fashion. So, this is an episode where it's really going to be talking about more assets for trustees that are managing assets for a family. A lot of times we get consultations, and a lot of times people ask, well, where are the assets in the family? How are they private? And so we talk about to the trustees assets that are unencumbered, assets that are already taxed, assets that are free, unencumbered assets. So we always appreciate everybody tuning in live, listening to replay. Appreciate Mississippi for tuning in live, listening to replay. Feel free to type into the chat where you tune in live, listening to replay from. Once again, you can feel free to reach out to Christian at trustchristian.com. Once again, that's Christian at trustchristian.com. So we'll go forward from there. This episode particularly is called private family property, and this is interesting because so many people contact the vault and they want to know about the unencumbered assets, how to manage them, and that's what the vault's all about: is trustee training, management skills, management concepts, how to minimize certain liabilities, and really just having a third-party experienced opinion dealing with high net worth investors and dealing with ultra high net worth investors when it comes to managing property privately, particularly the family's property. These are assets that are actually never meant to be sold. So a lot of times you get a lot of families that come into the private and they say, well, what's the best asset to purchase? So in trustee training, we talk about some of the things that are actually non-confiscatable, even by the government. We have to go that far dealing with our families because most of the families do want to be in a position where, if things can be confiscated, they want to be in a position where assets are not going to be because they have laws that are protecting them, particularly when it comes to the assets of gold and silver. Gold and silver are precious metals. Traditionally, we're talking about it in the hard metal form. Um, if we're talking about it in the hard metal form, then we're talking about it in a particular space where you have it, you're holding it. So many people ask, am I to have it? A lot of people ask, am I to hold it? And so this is something that we talk to trustees about in their families. Like, yes, you should hold it. A lot of times people ask about safety deposit boxes. We definitely don't recommend those with banks. That's something for the private, for the family to hold privately when it comes to property. So we're not just talking about gold. We're not just talking about silver. This isn't financial advice. It's not legal advice. We're talking about the traditional assets that we're talking to, whether it's trustees in the program, whether we're talking about people that are outside the program and may be trustees. We're talking about the traditional line of thought of people that are in private family property situations where they do have property and it's private. And so, how do you maintain that privacy with the property? And so, when we talk about the privacy with the property, we're talking about it from the perspective of the property is not in the public, and that's very important. So some people may say, well, what about if it's a family vehicle? Is that considered private property? Yes, it's considered private family property. Once you actually get it out of the public and into the private family capacity, then then you have more of a fighting chance for it to be private. How can it be private if it's in the public? Not just because it's registered. So many people come to the vault and they talk about registering things, and it's like, well, there's certain things that have to be registered because they're on public highways. You have the private family vehicle on a public highway. How does the highway get built? How is a private vehicle able to use a public highway? These are rules and appropriations that are already written in to these bills that are passed for these particular roads. So when we talk about people say, oh, I'm just traveling, I'm not driving, it's like, Well, you just don't understand it. There's a legal term for it. Driving. Even though you're traveling, which is private, you're talking about private, which is driving. And in turn, what can you do? You're on the public highway. How do you think these roads stay clean? The road doesn't just stay clean by itself. If you're private and you're not dealing with the taxes in the situation of that matter, how are you dealing with keeping a road clean if you're private? So when we talk about this to people and say, oh, everybody says, oh, I'm going private, I'm private. Well, how are you private and you're driving on the public, was that roadways? Now, we've had trustees come to us and they talk about, well, who's responsible for the charges on these public highways and things of that nature, and byways. Who's responsible for those charges, quote unquote, those penal charges? And so you clearly know who's in charge. It's business. It's business, not personal. Private family property is still in a private family capacity. Some people say, well, is it doing business in the public? Is it doing business with the public? Is it doing business with public people? Then in turn, you see why there may be some type of liability, some type of reporting requirement, some type of registration. But if the family is not doing public family business, then we would be talking about it from the private family property perspective, where the assets may not be engaged in growing with any type of public aid. They may just be growing based off of the fact that they're private assets and they're appreciated because they are an asset. So it has value. So it fluctuates, it goes up, it goes down. Gold and silver goes up, goes down. It's interesting to see people think that, oh, assets stay going up. That assets continue going up forever and ever, or they just take breaks. It's like, well, no, assets fluctuate in price. So if assets are fluctuating in price, and we're talking about it from the private family property perspective, same thing in a private family property perspective. Yes, the prices will fluctuate. It's not that the prices are going down past levels that you may have bought at, but and even if it does, of course, there may be times in the private family property perspective where yes, assets are acquired and they go down in value for a period, just based off a public market consensus. If it was to be issued in the public, if it was to be dealing in the public, if it was to be having any type of appreciation or value in the public, people in the public are gonna, price may fluctuate based off of their valuation, their assessment, their appraisal of the asset itself. So when we talk about private family property, we're talking about those assets that may not be listed in the public. So people say, well, how can the family house be private? Well, remember, it's business, not personal. So is it being held in a private capacity or is it held in a public capacity? Is it held in your name or is it held in a private family trust name, or is it held in a private family perspective? Whether it's any type of situation, what type of entity is it? So we have to be clear about what type of entity the property is being held in. We definitely have to be clear about that. And once we're clear about where the property is being held, then we know, is it public or is it private? Well, we know what perspective makes it private. We're talking about trusteeship. So that means own nothing, control everything. Trust Christian, own nothing, control everything. Private family property is for you to own nothing, control everything. Simple. Private family property deals with you not having anything in your name, and then assets are being passed along from one generation to the next. You know it's private when there's no liability for passing it along from one generation to the next. You're familiar with inheritance tax or estate tax. When a estate is passed along from one generation to the next, there's a liability. There are a lot of countries that assess this. Not every country assesses this liability because it is a liability. This is where you have the private family property perspective, where things in the private family property perspective are not liabilities. This is where you are completely focused on acquiring assets. You hold assets and you're growing assets privately. Not and growing them may just be having them, may just have acquisition of the hold or holding of the asset, which allows for it to be specifically in more of just a private position, just we say in private position, but it pretty much pushed it, whatever entity is holding that, whatever holding company, whatever acquisition company. Nowadays they got these things called SPACs, special acquisition companies, corporations or whatever. They got these special acquisition companies. So how are they putting families in the private perspective if they're doing it from a special acquisition, a special purpose acquisition company. Well, think about it. The private family property perspective is there is a indenture, there's a purpose, there's a document, there's an intent behind what's supposed to happen. And what's supposed to happen is there's supposed to be a private administration of family assets, not public. Public means where you go to the public courthouse, you're dealing with probate, you're dealing with the lawyers, you're dealing with the will. Whereas in the private perspective, own nothing, control everything. It goes from one generation to the next. It's private, it's not public. In our sector, we don't give our children, the money, the assets. They're not beneficiaries. That makes them liable. Private family property means you don't take it out of the family name and give it to the children. You keep it in the family name. Because the last name, it seems as though, can be passed along tax free. The first name and the last name is where people run into issues. Period. That's where they run into issues. They run into issues because them trying to be the main player, main person, makes them liable. They want to own something. Whereas in the private sector, private family property perspective says that, yep, we're going to make sure that it's in the family name and administer it from one generation to the next. Appreciate everybody for tuning live, listening to replay. Look forward to hearing from y'all. Christian at trustchristian.com. Peace.